Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. The screech of tires echoed through the quiet country road as the luxury sports car veered off course, crashing violently into the thick trees lining the edge of the highway. It was a sound no one expected, a loud, splintering crack, the shriek of metal meeting wood, followed by a painful silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint hum of the engine, now sputtering, as the car came to a complete halt. Inside, the millionaire, David Sterling, lay slumped over the steering wheel. Blood trickled from a deep gash on his forehead, his hand loosely gripping the airbag that had failed to deploy. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He had been in control, had always been in control of his life, until now. Minutes felt like hours. David tried to push himself upright, but his body wouldn't respond, his vision blurred. The once invincible man who had built an empire with his own hands now found himself helpless, stranded in the middle of nowhere. With no one to turn to outside, the sky was turning a dusky orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The car's headlights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. There was no sign of traffic, no nearby homes, just a stretch of road that seemed to stretch on forever. David's mind raced, the adrenaline pumping through his veins in a futile attempt to keep him alert. He could hear the sound of birds rustling in the trees, the soft murmur of a breeze. The calmness of nature contrasted sharply with the chaos inside him, and then, just as the world seemed to fade to black, he heard something. A distant sound, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. At first he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, closer this time. He managed to turn his head slightly, his eyes barely open. Through the cracked windshield, he saw a figure emerging from the woods. The silhouette was tall, rugged, a man dressed in tattered clothes walking with a limp. David's heart skipped a beat. In his state, he couldn't tell if it was a dream or reality. Was this some kind of hallucination? But no, the figure was real. The man was coming closer. David tried to shout, but the words wouldn't form. His throat was dry, constricted with panic. He was slipping in and out of consciousness now, the edges of his awareness blurring. The stranger reached the car and stopped just in front of it. He didn't seem to be in any rush. He looked down at David, his eyes scanning the wreckage, then slowly bent down, crouching beside the car. David could feel the presence of the stranger. The man's eyes were sharp, observant, and calculating. "Can you hear me?" the stranger asked, his voice rough, worn from years of hard living. David tried to nod, but his body betrayed him. His vision faded, his eyelids heavy as the darkness claimed him again. The world was different now. When David Sterling awoke, the first thing he felt was pain. His body ached from head to toe. He could hear the faint crackle of a fire nearby, and the smell of something earthy filled his nose. The sounds of nature were louder now, closer, almost as if they had enveloped him. He was no longer in the car, but lying on the ground, his head resting against something hard, and his hands bound by rough, coarse rope. His heart pounded. Panic surged through him as the memories of the crash came flooding back. What had happened? Where was he? Through his haze, he tried to focus. The man, the stranger who had found him. What had he done? Where was he now? David's vision cleared, and he finally managed to focus on his surroundings. He was lying under a small shelter, surrounded by trees, a makeshift camp. The fire crackled. In the center, the flames dancing. There was a pile of logs next to it, and a strange, old-fashioned tent nearby. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and there was an almost eerie silence in the wilderness. The only sound came from the fire and the wind rustling the leaves above. A rustling noise to his left caught his attention. David turned his head slowly, his neck sore. The stranger appeared again, now standing nearby, sharpening a knife on a stone. His face was rugged, weathered from years of living off the land. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, and his hands were calloused from years of hard work. David tried to speak again, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. His voice cracked as he forced the words out. What do you want from me?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. The man didn't answer right away. He continued sharpening the knife, his eyes never leaving the blade. The sound of metal on stone filled the air as the silence stretched on. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't want anything from you. I saved your life." David blinked, confused. "Saved my life?" The man nodded, placing the knife down on a flat rock. He reached for a tin cup of water and knelt beside David. "You were in a car crash. I heard it. Came running when I saw you weren't moving. Took me a while to get you here. But you're alive." David's mind raced. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. His hands were bound to a nearby post, and his body felt like it was made of lead. Every movement sent sharp pain through his muscles. "How long have I been here?" David whispered. "A few hours," the man replied. "Don't worry, you're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." David's heart skipped a beat. This man had saved his life, but who was he? What was he doing out here in the wilderness? And why was he holding David captive? There were too many questions, too many unanswered things swirling in David's mind. But before he could voice another one, the man stood and turned to look at the fire. "You need rest," the stranger said, his back to David. "You'll have plenty of time to ask questions. But first, you need to heal." David stared at the stranger, a sense of unease creeping over him. There was something unsettling about this man, something that David couldn't quite put his finger on. He had saved him, yes, but why? What did he want? The fire crackled again, and David's eyes fluttered closed, his body too exhausted to stay awake. But as sleep claimed him, one thought lingered in his mind. This wasn't over. The man's appearance in his life had been no accident. There was something far deeper going on here, a mystery that had only just begun to unfold. David woke to the faint sound of crackling embers. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the forest. The campfire was still burning, though it was much lower than before. He could hear the wind moving through the trees, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. It felt like he had been asleep for days, though he knew it had only been hours since the accident. He tried to move his hands, but the ropes still bound him tightly. His wrists were sore from the rough ropes, and his body ached all over, the memory of the crash still fresh in his mind. He hadn't imagined it. The car, the crash, the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere. His savior. David shifted, trying to sit up, but the pain in his body made him wince. He glanced around. The stranger was nowhere in sight, but the fire still crackled, and the warmth of it seemed to seep into his bones. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the events of the previous hours. The crash had been violent. The sharp turn, the screech of tires, and the sudden impact had all happened in an instant. How had he survived? How had he ended up in this strange place with no memory of what had happened after he was thrown from the car? And who was this man who had come to his rescue? David's mind spun with questions, but before he could dwell on them any longer, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. He turned his head, his body groaning in protest as he did, and saw the stranger approaching. The man had a grim expression on his face, his steps slow and measured. He didn't speak as he neared the fire, but his eyes never left David. There was a certain intensity in his gaze, as though he were studying him, evaluating him. It was unsettling. David swallowed hard, trying to gather the strength to speak. His throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper when he managed to ask, "Who are you?" The stranger paused, as if considering the question. Then, with a grunt, he knelt beside David, his knees cracking as he did. I'm someone who's seen enough to know that people like you don't last long in places like this. David's brow furrowed in confusion. People like me? The stranger's lips curled into a faint, almost cynical smile. People who think they can just go through life without really knowing what's going on around them. People who think money, power, and connections can solve everything. David's heart skipped a beat. The stranger's words struck a chord deep inside him. There was a bitterness in his voice, a world-weariness that made David uneasy. I don't understand. Of course you don't, the man muttered, shaking his head. But you will, if you're smart enough to survive. David's eyes narrowed. Survive what? What is this place? The stranger leaned back on his heels, taking in a deep breath. His gaze seemed far away, lost in some distant memory. This is a place where people come when they're lost, when they've got nowhere else to go, when the world has given up on them, and they've given up on the world. David's pulse quickened. You're saying I'm lost? The man's eyes flickered briefly to the fire before meeting David's gaze again. You're not lost yet, but you're heading in that direction. David felt a knot form in his stomach. The words were cryptic, but there was something unsettling about the way the man spoke. It was as if he knew something David didn't, something that could change everything. Why did you save me? David asked, his voice steady, despite the growing sense of unease. The stranger's eyes shifted, his expression unreadable. Because I don't leave people to die, not if I can help it. David took a deep breath, trying to process the situation. He was alive, yes, but he didn't know where he was. He didn't know who this man was, and he certainly didn't know why he had been brought here. He tried to break free from the ropes that bound his hands, but the stranger moved quickly, grabbing his wrist before he could make any progress. Easy, the man said, his grip firm but not aggressive. You're not going anywhere yet. You're in no condition to leave. David glared at him, frustration building inside. What do you want from me? Why won't you just let me go? The stranger sighed, as though he had expected this response. You don't understand, not yet, but you will. Just give it time. David's mind was reeling. The stranger's cryptic responses only made him more anxious. He needed answers. He needed to know what had happened to him, why he was here, and what the man's intentions were. Before he could ask another question, the man stood up and started walking toward the edge of the camp. David watched him, confused and growing, more agitated by the second. You'll have to wait for now, the man said over his shoulder. The night's coming. You need to rest. David opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. The man had already disappeared into the shadows of the forest, leaving him alone by the fire. With nothing else to do, David closed his eyes, hoping for some semblance of peace, but the question still lingered. What was going on here? Why was he alive? And who was the man who had saved him? As the hours passed, the sounds of the forest grew louder, the crackling fire, the distant chirps of insects, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees all seemed to fill the air with a strange energy. David could feel the tension in his muscles, his mind working overtime to process everything that had happened. At some point, he fell into a restless sleep. But even in his dreams, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the man who had saved him had more to do with his accident than he was letting on. The morning after David woke again, the light of the morning sun filtering through the trees. The pain in his body was still intense, but he could feel a slight improvement. The ropes were gone, and he was lying on a bed of rough blankets. His mind was foggy, but one thing was clear. He needed to get out of here. He pushed himself up slowly, wincing at the pain. His head was still throbbing, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He was alive, and he needed answers. The camp was silent, save for the crackling fire. The stranger was nowhere to be seen. David took a deep breath, gathering his strength. This was it. This was his chance to escape. He rose to his feet, stumbling slightly as his legs protested, and took his first cautious step toward the edge of the camp. He didn't know where the stranger had gone, but he wasn't going to waste this opportunity. He moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but every step felt like a betrayal of the quiet peace he had felt moments before. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. "Where do you think you're going?" David froze. The stranger had returned, standing just a few feet away, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. David turned slowly, his mind racing. "I'm leaving. I need to get out of here." The stranger shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "You're not ready." David clenched his jaw, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. "I don't need you. I don't need anyone. I can handle this on my own." The man's gaze softened for a moment, but his stance remained strong. "You're not handling anything, David. Not yet. And running away won't change that." David opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. The stranger was right. He was far from ready. The accident, the man's rescue, the wilderness, it was all too much to process. "I don't understand," David said, his voice quieter now. "What's happening? Why am I here?" The stranger stepped closer, his expression now serious. "You're here because you need to learn something. Something about yourself. Something about the world you've been living in. And that's something you can't run from." David swallowed hard, his pulse racing. This man, this stranger, knew things that David didn't, things that could change everything. But what? The stranger's next words struck David like a thunderbolt. "Your life is about to change forever, whether you're ready or not." The morning was quiet, but it was an uneasy silence. David had been up for hours now, pacing around the small camp, his mind racing. Every sound, every rustle of the wind through the trees made him jump. He couldn't sit still. He needed answers. The stranger, whoever he was, had made it clear that David's life had changed. But how? And why? David stood by the campfire, staring into the flickering flames, his fingers nervously twitching as he wrestled with his thoughts. He had been in control of his life. A millionaire, a man who had everything. Yet here he was, trapped in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation, and his world turned upside down. The stranger, who had come to his rescue, was still nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared into the wilderness after their tense conversation, leaving David with more questions than ever before. What was this man's game? Why had he saved him? What was it he wanted? David couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger knew more than he was letting on. But why wouldn't he just tell him? What was the secret? He needed to get out of here. He needed to find a way back to his old life, back to the luxury, the comfort, the familiar. But as he stared at the distant trees, a growing sense of unease washed over him. There was no going back. Not yet. The man's words echoed in his mind. "Your life is about to change forever. Whether you're ready or not." David felt a chill crawl down his spine. He couldn't ignore it. The crash had been no accident. It was as if fate had led him here. But why? What was the purpose of all this? And what did it have to do with the stranger who had saved him? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, only to find the stranger standing a few feet away. He had returned, his expression still unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. David swallowed, his voice a little shaky. "You're back." The stranger didn't reply immediately. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on David. It was as if he were waiting for something, something that David didn't understand. "You've been avoiding me," David said, trying to mask the fear and frustration in his voice. "I'm not avoiding you," the stranger replied, his tone calm. "I'm just giving you space to think." David frowned. "Think about what?" The stranger moved closer, his gaze still intense. Think about the choices you've made, the life you've built, everything you thought you knew. David's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? I don't understand. I don't even know who you are. Why am I here? The man took a deep breath, and for a moment David thought he saw a flicker of something human in his eyes. Something that wasn't as cold or calculating as before, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. You're here because you're being given a chance, the stranger said slowly. A chance to see the world differently, a chance to change. David felt a sharp pang of confusion. A chance to change? I don't need to change. I have everything I need. I've worked for everything I have. What more could there be? The stranger's gaze softened, but only for a moment. That's the problem, David. You think you've worked for everything you have, but you haven't. The world doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. And you're about to find that out the hard way. David's mind was racing. His thoughts were scattered, chaotic. The world doesn't work that way. What was he supposed to learn from all of this? What was the point of this strange encounter, this accident, and this mysterious man? You keep saying I need to change, but how? What do you want from me? David's voice was a mix of desperation and frustration. The stranger's eyes hardened. Again, I don't want anything from you, David. This isn't about me. It's about you. It's about what you can't see, what you've been blind to for years. You've been living in a bubble, thinking that everything you want is at your fingertips. But now, that bubble has burst, and you're going to have to face what's real. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, to protest, but something in the stranger's words struck him. What you can't see, what you've been blind to for years, could it be possible? Had he really been so blind? The stranger's voice cut through his thoughts. You've been living a life built on illusions, a life where wealth and power can fix anything. But that's not how it works. And you're about to learn that the hard way. David could feel the weight of the stranger's words pressing down on him. He was right in one way. His life had always been about power, about control. He had built his empire with his own hands, using every tool at his disposal, and it had worked. But what if the world wasn't as simple as that? What if there was more to life than just money and success? Why me? David finally asked, his voice softer now. Why are you telling me all this? The stranger took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he looked at David. Because you're the one who needs to hear it. You're the one who has the most to lose. David swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what the man was saying. His heart was pounding, but there was a strange, undeniable feeling creeping into his chest. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, the stranger was right. You've been given a second chance, David, the stranger continued. A chance to wake up, to see the world for what it really is. But it's not going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. David's mind was still spinning. A second chance. It felt absurd. He had everything he had ever wanted, and yet here he was, struggling with feelings he couldn't explain. The stranger gave a single, sharp nod, as though reading David's thoughts. You can leave whenever you want. You can go back to your old life, but remember this, you're old. Life doesn't exist anymore. You can't go back. David's heart dropped at the finality of the words. His old life doesn't exist anymore. But what am I supposed to do? David's voice was shaky, but there was a spark of something in him, something that pushed him to ask the question. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at David for a long moment before turning away. You'll figure it out, but first you need to survive. The rest will come after. David stood still, his thoughts racing as the stranger walked away once again. This was no accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a test that would change his life forever. David lay in his makeshift bed, his body sore and stiff. He stared up at the ceiling of the small shelter, the soft crackle of the campfire, the only sound in the quiet night. His mind refused to settle, constantly replaying the words of the stranger over and over again. Your old life doesn't exist anymore. You can't go back. It didn't make sense. How could it be true? His life had been everything he had ever worked for. The business, the wealth, the fame, all of it had been within his grasp. He had it all, and now it was gone. David turned onto his side, the coolness of the night air brushing against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the fire. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he thought about what the stranger had said, a second chance to see the world for what it really is. Was that really what this was all about? A lesson in humility? Was he really that blind to the world around him? He had always believed that power could buy happiness, that success was the ultimate measure of a life well lived. But now, in the midst of the wilderness, stripped of everything that once defined him, those beliefs felt hollow. His thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound outside the shelter. He tensed, his muscles tight with anticipation. He hadn't seen the stranger for hours, and he wasn't sure where he had gone. The flap of the shelter was pulled back, and the stranger appeared, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the fire. His expression was as unreadable as ever. His eyes focused on something just beyond David. "You're awake," the stranger said, his voice steady, almost detached. David sat up slowly, his body aching with the movement. "I can't stop thinking about what you said," he admitted. "How can you say, my old life doesn't exist anymore? It doesn't make any sense." The stranger stepped inside, the dim light casting long shadows across his weathered face. He didn't sit down, but instead remained standing, his gaze fixed on David. "You don't need to understand yet, but you will." David clenched his fists, trying to push away the frustration that bubbled up inside him. "You keep saying that, but I need answers. I don't know why I'm here. Why did you save me? What do you want from me?" The stranger's gaze softened, but only briefly. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do. But you're here because you have something to learn. The life you've been living, the one you thought was yours. It's not the reality of the world. It's an illusion." David swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had worked his entire life to build that illusion. How could the stranger be so sure of himself? What did he know that David didn't? "Do you think that's all life is? Money? Power? Success?" The stranger's voice grew quieter, more intense. "You think you've seen the world, but you haven't. You haven't seen what really matters. What it means to survive, to struggle, to be human." David stared at him, his mind spinning. "I've had everything. I've done everything. What's left?" The stranger's expression darkened. "What's left is for you to learn what it really means to live. Not to exist, but to truly live." David felt the weight of the words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he didn't know how. The stranger's words were too powerful, too unsettling. His entire sense of reality was being shaken to its core. "You'll never understand until you're forced to," the stranger said, his voice soft but firm. "This is about survival, about learning to live with nothing, to find meaning in a world that doesn't care about who you are or what you have. This is about finding out who you really are when everything you've known is gone." David's mind reeled. His entire world had been built on the idea that he could control his fate, that money and influence would get him whatever he wanted. But now, in the midst of this wilderness, he was completely helpless. He had no control, no power, and the stranger seemed to know it. "You're going to need to make a choice," the stranger continued. "You can keep fighting this reality, keep resisting the truth, or you can accept it and start over. The choice is yours, but I'm warning you, it won't be easy." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He didn't know what to do. His mind was a blur, the world around him spinning faster than he could keep up. The stranger was right about one thing. His old life was gone. It wasn't just the crash. It was everything. The false sense of security, the belief that he was in control, that was all gone. And now he was left with nothing but these words, these lessons that seemed to mock him. David opened his eyes and looked at the stranger. "What happens now?" The man studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Now, you learn to survive. You'll work with me. You'll learn what it means to live when you have nothing. You'll learn to build again, from scratch." David felt his pulse quicken. The idea of starting over was terrifying. He had been at the top of the world. The thought of beginning again with nothing was overwhelming. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flared. Maybe this was exactly what he needed. Maybe this was his second chance. "Fine," David said, his voice low but firm. "Teach me." The stranger nodded, a faint smile flickering on his lips. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." Survival. Training begins. The next few days were a blur of physical labor, harsh lessons, and harsh realities. David had never been one for manual labor. He had always been the businessman, the one who made the decisions, who called the shots. But now he was forced to work with his hands, to dig and build and learn the basics of survival in the wilderness. The stranger showed him how to gather food from the forest, how to build shelter, and how to make fire from scratch. Each day, David was pushed further than he had ever been pushed before. His body ached in places he didn't know could hurt. His hands were raw from the work, and his mind struggled to keep up with the pace. At first, he fought against it. He tried to revert to his old ways, to rely on his wealth and influence. But the stranger was relentless. Every time David made an excuse or tried to skip a task, the man was there, reminding him that there was no room for shortcuts in survival. There were no shortcuts in life. David began to realize the truth in the stranger's words. The things he had once considered important, his wealth, his status, his power, meant nothing in this world. They didn't help him build shelter. They didn't help him make fire. They didn't help him survive. But there was something else, something unexpected that he began to understand. The stranger wasn't just teaching him how to survive physically. He was teaching him something deeper, something about himself. The lessons weren't just about building fires or catching fish. They were about understanding his place in the world, about realizing that he was no more important than the trees, the animals, or the earth itself. David began to see the world in a new light. He started to appreciate the simplicity of life, the connection to the earth, and the peace that came from working with his hands. He wasn't in control anymore, and that scared him. But it also freed him. The first test one day, the stranger told David that it was time for his first test. They walked into the forest, the trees towering above them. David felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. What would this test be? What was he supposed to do? The stranger stopped and turned to face him. "Your test is simple," he said. "You need to find your way back to camp, without me, alone." David blinked, confusion washing over him. "What? How am I supposed to do that?" "You've learned the basics. Now you need to trust yourself," the stranger replied. "This is about survival, about trusting your instincts." David's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of the task. He had to navigate the wilderness with nothing but his wits and the skills he had learned over the past few days. "You'll be fine," the stranger said, turning to leave. "Remember everything I taught you. Use it." David took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it, his test, to prove that he could survive. He had no choice but to try. David had never known a world like this before. Every step he took felt like he was walking on the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether he would fall or rise. The stranger's words echoed in his mind constantly. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. But how could he trust himself? The old David, the successful, powerful man, was gone. In his place was a man stripped of his possessions, his status and his ego. Everything that had once defined him had been torn away, and now he was left with the raw, unfiltered version of himself. It was the kind of feeling that made him want to run, to retreat back to his old life, where everything was comfortable, where he had control. But there was no going back. The wilderness had shown him the truth, whether he was ready for it or not. It had forced him to confront who he really was, and in doing so, it had shattered every illusion he had ever held about himself. David sat by the campfire, his mind swirling with confusion and frustration. The forest around him was quiet, peaceful, even, but inside he was a storm. His body ached from the relentless work he had been doing over the past days. His hands were calloused and blistered from building shelters and starting fires. His muscles screamed for rest, but there was no time for rest. The stranger had made that clear. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about resilience. The stranger was sitting across from him, his eyes fixed on the flames. David had learned that the man rarely spoke without reason. When he did speak, it was usually something cryptic and unsettling. David opened his mouth to ask the question that had been gnawing at him for days, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer. "What is it that you want me to learn?" David finally asked, his voice low. The stranger didn't look at him at first. He continued to watch the flames, as though considering his response carefully. "You're learning to survive," the man said after a long pause. "But you're also learning to live with the reality of your situation. Your old life is gone. You have nothing now, and that's not just physical. It's mental. It's emotional. You're going to have to learn how to live with that." David swallowed, the weight of the words sinking in. He had felt the loss in every fiber of his being, but hearing the stranger say it so bluntly made the loss seem final, irrevocable. "I don't understand," David muttered. "How do I live with that? How do I just let go of everything I had?" The stranger finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You don't let go. You learn to live without it. You learn that the world doesn't revolve around your possessions or your status. It never did. You've just been too blinded by your own ego to see it." David's heart pounded in his chest. The man's words were a direct hit, each one landing with brutal precision. Everything he had worked for, everything he had strived for, was meaningless in the face of survival. His wealth, his power, his influence, it had all been an illusion. In the wilderness, those things didn't matter. It was just him, the land, and the struggle to survive. The stranger didn't let up. "The world doesn't care who you are or what you've done. The only thing that matters is whether you can adapt, whether you can survive, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll stop fighting reality." David closed his eyes, his chest tight. He wanted to resist. He wanted to argue that he could go back, that he could build something better, bigger, more powerful. But the truth was staring him in the face. He had no control anymore. The world had turned its back on him, and now he had to learn how to navigate it without the crutch of his former life. The first true test. It wasn't long before the stranger told David it was time for his first real test. A test that would push him beyond his limits, forcing him to rely entirely on what he had learned. The stranger led David into the forest, the air cool against his skin, the rustling of the trees a constant companion. David's heart was racing. What would this test entail? What would he have to do? They walked for miles, the terrain growing rougher and more challenging as they moved deeper into the forest. The sounds of the world outside faded, leaving only the sounds of the wilderness. The stillness was deafening. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing. The stranger turned to face David, his eyes hard, his face unreadable. "This is where it begins," the stranger said. "You need to find your way back to camp, alone." David froze. "What do you mean, alone?" The stranger's gaze didn't soften. "You've learned enough to survive on your own. Now you need to prove it. You need to trust yourself. This is about independence. The world won't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't care about your doubts. You need to navigate your way back to camp without my help, and you need to do it before nightfall." David's mind raced. Alone, out here, in the forest, with nothing but his wits to guide him? The stranger saw the hesitation in his eyes. "This is the test, David, the test of everything you've learned so far. There's no room for excuses. You either do it or you don't." David opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. There was no way out of this. The stranger wasn't going to help him. This was the moment of truth, the moment where he had to prove that he had learned something, that he had changed. With a deep breath, David nodded. "I'll do it." The stranger studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Remember, trust yourself. The journey alone." David began his journey back, the weight of the stranger's words pressing on him. He had been in the forest before, but this time everything felt different. Every step he took seemed uncertain, each sound in the woods magnified in his ears. His senses were on high alert as he moved deeper into the wilderness. He didn't know how long he had been walking. Hours. It felt like days. The world seemed to shift around him, the trees closing in, the underbrush growing thicker. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could easily get lost. He tried to use everything the stranger had taught him, how to read the signs of nature, how to follow the patterns of the wind and the sun. But the longer he walked, the more his confidence wavered. His old self wanted to take over, to use logic, strategy, and intellect to find his way. But in this place, there was no room for those things. There was only survival. David found himself standing at the edge of a ravine, his heart racing. The path had led him here, but now he had no idea how to cross. The river below rushed by, the sound deafening. The water was wild, the current swift and unforgiving. His first instinct was to find a way around, but the stranger's words echoed in his mind again. Trust yourself. What did that mean? What was he supposed to do? He scanned his surroundings, his mind whirling. Then his gaze landed on a series of thick vines hanging from the trees above the ravine. They were strong enough to hold his weight, but was he strong enough to make the leap? There was no time to waste. If he didn't cross, now he might not make it back before nightfall. He couldn't afford to fail. David gritted his teeth and swung across the vines, his body moving with a sense of desperation. His muscles screamed in protest as he pulled himself over the ravine, but he kept going. He had no choice. He had to do this. When he finally made it to the other side, his hands trembling with exhaustion, David looked back at the ravine, the rushing water below him. He had done it. He had made it across. But the victory was short-lived. There was still so much more to prove. He wasn't done yet. David sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the cold, unsettling emptiness inside him. The journey he had been on was about to end, but he wasn't sure what awaited him on the other side. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "You've learned to survive. Now it's time to live." It had been weeks since the accident, weeks of pain, exhaustion, frustration, and self-doubt. The wilderness had stripped him down to his core, leaving him with nothing but the raw truth about who he really was. And yet there was still something he couldn't shake, a lingering feeling that he wasn't done, that there was still one more lesson to learn. David had learned to build shelters, catch food, and start fires. He had learned to navigate the forest and rely on his instincts. But what was the point of it all? What had it all been for? He was no longer the man he had been before, but was he the man he was supposed to become? The stranger had left him alone for the past few days, saying he needed to reflect. He had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving David to confront his inner demons. It had been a solitary, agonizing few days. The silence of the forest had become deafening, the weight of his thoughts almost too much to bear. Every question he had ever asked himself seemed to circle in his mind like vultures waiting to pick apart his soul. But now, the stranger was back. And David could sense that the final test was coming, the one that would truly define who he had become. David heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and his heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, the cold, sweat on his palms betraying his nerves. The stranger emerged from the shadows, his face as unreadable as ever. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement. The man simply walked to the fire and stood there, staring into the flames. "You're here," David said, his voice quiet. The stranger nodded, his eyes never leaving the fire. "You've come a long way." David swallowed hard. "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I've learned enough." The stranger finally looked at him, his gaze sharp. "The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you can accept what you've learned." David's pulse quickened. He didn't know what the stranger meant. What was it that he still needed to accept? "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The stranger took a step closer, his presence overpowering. "You've learned to survive, but survival is not enough. You've learned that there's more to life than power, than wealth. But that's only half of it. The real lesson is about understanding your place in the world, accepting who you are and who you're not, accepting that you cannot control everything and that sometimes letting go is the hardest, but most important thing you'll ever do." David's heart was racing. The stranger's words were like a riddle, and the more he tried to understand them, the more confused he became. Letting go? How could he let go of everything he had worked for? How could he accept being a nobody, a man with nothing? "But I don't want to let go," David said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't want to lose everything. I don't want to be nothing." The stranger's eyes softened, though his face remained stoic. "You don't have to be nothing, David. You have everything inside you already. The question is whether you can accept it, whether you can live with it." David's breath caught in his throat. The reality of what the stranger was saying was beginning to sink in. The illusion of control he had once clung to, the belief that power could fix everything, he had to let go of that. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, truly living. It was about finding peace with who he was, without the crutch of wealth or status. "Let go of what?" David asked, his voice shaking. The stranger looked him dead in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "Let go of your need for control. Let go of the fear that holds you back. Let go of the belief that the world owes you something. The world owes you nothing. You owe yourself everything." David's chest tightened as the weight of the words hit him. Everything he had worked for had been a mirage. His life had been built on an illusion of control, of power, of dominance, and now that illusion had crumbled. He stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of everything. The stranger was right. He had been so focused on controlling every aspect of his life that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live, to be at peace with himself, to accept the chaos of the world and still find meaning. For the first time in his life, David felt completely powerless. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he would ever return to his old life, but that thought no longer terrified him. Instead, it felt like a release, a freedom. David took a deep breath, his chest expanding with the realization that he could no longer keep holding on to the past. The world wasn't what he had thought it was, and neither was he. He was not the man he had been before. He was something different now, something better, but only if he could let go of his old self. The true test. The stranger watched him for a long moment, as though assessing whether David had truly understood. Then he spoke again, his voice steady but tinged with finality. The test isn't about surviving anymore, David. It's about living. You're going to face the hardest challenge yet. A challenge that will push everything you've learned to the limit. And this time, there's no running away. There's no going back. David felt his stomach drop. This was it. This was the final test, the moment he had been preparing for, whether he realized it or not. "What do I have to do?" David asked, his voice tight. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He simply turned and motioned for David to follow. David's heart raced as he walked behind the man, unsure of what awaited him. They walked for miles deeper into the wilderness. The terrain grew harsher, the air thicker, until it felt like they had crossed some invisible threshold. David's body ached, his muscles protesting with every step. But he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. Finally, they arrived at a steep cliff overlooking a chasm. The wind howled through the valley below, and the trees swayed ominously in the gusts. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, and for a moment David felt as though the ground beneath him might give way. "Your final test is simple," the stranger said, his voice unwavering. "You need to cross this chasm, by any means necessary, but you can't rely on anything you've used before. No tools, no shortcuts. You have to do this with what you've learned here. Trust your instincts." David stared at the chasm, his throat dry. The thought of crossing it seemed impossible. There was no bridge, no rope, just a sheer drop below. It was as if the world itself was daring him to fail. The stranger stood behind him, silent and unwavering. "This is your test, David. You either cross it, or you stay here forever." David's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. He couldn't stay here. He had to move forward. He had to cross. Taking a deep breath, David turned and faced the cliff, his legs shaking with uncertainty. He could feel his body trembling, but he didn't back down. The stranger was right. This was his moment. The moment to prove that he had truly learned something, that he had changed. Without another thought, David took his first step toward the edge. The leap of faith. David didn't know how long he stood there, looking into the abyss. The wind howled, urging him to move, but his mind screamed at him to stop. Everything inside him told him it was too dangerous, too impossible. But there was no turning back now. He took another step, and then another. His feet moved without thinking, as if something deep inside him had taken over. He didn't stop to question it. He just kept moving. And then, when it seemed like the ground was about to give way beneath him, he leapt. For a moment, the world went silent. The air was cold, and for an instant David thought he might fall. But then he felt it, the vine, the rope, the very thing that he had overlooked in his panic. It was right there, hanging from the opposite cliff, waiting for him to grab onto it. David reached out, his fingers grazing the vine. His heart pounded in his chest as he grasped it tightly. The world around him swirled into focus. He had done it. He had crossed the chasm. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and his past, and he had succeeded. When he finally reached the other side, breathless and exhausted, he looked back at the stranger. The man was standing there, watching him, a faint smile on his lips. "Well done," the stranger said simply. "You've crossed the chasm, but more importantly, you've crossed yourself." David stood there, his heart still racing. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to control the world around him. He didn't need to be the man he once was. He was free. The end